Hi there, my name is Andy Farquharson and I'm your host on Alternative Exit,
the podcast dedicated to educating small business owners about the possibilities, benefits and challenges of transitioning to an employee ownership model. Did you know that there are over 200 million SMEs around the globe with an owner that will be retiring within the next 10 years? Many of these owners will never actually find a buyer for their business, forcing them to close their doors, wreaking havoc on their employees and the communities. There is an alternative. This show will explore different forms of employee ownership and the best practices for a successful transition. Each episode is going to feature interviews with experts on employee ownership, business owners who've successfully made the transition, and consultants who've helped facilitate these changes.
Okay, now let's get on with the show.
Hello and welcome to the Alternative Exit. Look, I'm really excited about this one today because we're joined by Jon Shell. Now, Jon is a leading advocate for employee ownership, and look, he's been the driving force behind the successful efforts to introduce employee ownership trust to Canada. What I'm most excited about, though, is the rich background in which Jon brings to this. He's been a successful entrepreneur, but now he's taken that and transitioned his focus towards policy and finance, and he's really sort of educating and challenging how people think out there on LinkedIn and also via a lot of his policy work. He's been instrumental in introducing many innovations to the employee ownership industry, from direct ownership models for successful transitions, and also that establishment of the employee ownership in Canada and the world's first ownership fund, I think. I don't know, we'll question you on that a little bit.
I don't know about that.
But either way, super excited to dive into the journey and insights on sort of how employee ownership can transform businesses and promote sort of equitable wealth distribution among us all. Jon, welcome to the Alternative Exit.
Thanks, Andy. That's quite the intro. I hope
There's so much content out there from LinkedIn. I marked to you earlier that, you've been super busy. So it's great. It seems like there's no hiding what you're thinking, sort of when it comes to some...
For better or for worse.
For better or for worse. Look, I find, though, a lot of the times it's a great, challenging conversation that obviously talks a little bit more around how to make a better place for people to live. I mean, you're obviously focused a lot on Canada because you're a Canadian, but a lot of this transcends to other economies too. So when you think about your journey, you had a successful career as an entrepreneur, in acquiring veterinary practices in both Australia and Canada, I think. So what drove you to change your focus to be an advocate for small business and employee ownership?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the veterinary experience was interesting, right? When we started buying veterinary practices back in 2006 in Canada, we were primarily buying practices where the owner had no one to sell to, right? It wasn't a matter that we would come in and be like, we're going to shower you with bags of money. It was, do you not have an exit plan? And if not, we can be your exit plan and we'll pay you what the going rate is. Going rate, at the time was around 4 times cash flow for a vet practice. And over the course of my time in the industry, which would have been from 2016 to roughly 2017 or 18, that changed dramatically. Veterinary became an area of interest for private equity funds backed by pension funds. And over time, the price of a practice went from 4 times cash flow to sort of, as high as 20 times cash flow. And that shut out regular veterinarians. I mean, and this is publicly reported, the price of some of these practices and some of the groups that were assembled. So, a real dramatic shift. That dramatic shift had implications on the ground, right? Where veterinarians who were in practices for decades and had made deals with owners to buy out those practices from the owners, supported by the bank, none of that worked anymore. And so the implication is that there was a shift of ownership in that sector away from veterinarians to people like me. And it wasn't obvious to me that was good, despite it being me. And it caused me to reflect a lot on what was happening in the world and around ownership and the transition of ownership to more concentrated hands. Look, I think the company we ran is a good one. And, my partner is a good person who would have done his absolute best to respect the legacy of the practices that we acquired. And that was a real philosophy behind what we were doing, and he would have done that whether we were buying at 4 or whether we were buying at 20. The point is that the introduction of capital into the industry changed the price of the asset without the asset itself having changed. And the implication of that is that only certain people were able to own it, right, afterwards. And that is the thing that I'm not sure makes sense for the world.
Yeah, I mean, because it's specifically in the veterinary world, like it changed the total dynamics of how people progressed, like how people actually sort of work their whole career, because that's established, as you said, like that established within a practice and grow into it.
And look, so at the time, I'm wondering about this. I read a book called Capital in the 21st Century. That book has a mixed, review, I suppose, in the world. It was a slog, right? I wasn't working at the time, so I took 2 weeks and read this book, and it traced the history of wealth concentration, right? And the point it makes is that income inequality isn't the problem. Wealth inequality is the problem, right? Passive assets that create income streams or create value for people being concentrated to more and more hands is the thing that drives inequality over the long term. And that really resonated with me as someone who was the recipient of a bunch of wealth because of ownership, and who had witnessed kind of the shift in ownership in an industry and had observed it in other industries as well. And so that made me think that some shift was required to take ownership and prevent it from becoming so concentrated that inequality would be irreversible, which, is the path we're on. It makes it harder for us to act on climate change. It makes it harder for us to act on social policy. And as long as we are on this path, I think it threatens the future of democracy.
It's got some big implications then, doesn't it? Like when it sort of the wealth keeps bubbling to the top. So I guess one of the biggest things that you've done recently, like or been a part of doing recently to help combat that, is been supporting the federal legislation in Canada to introduce the EOT. So I'd love it if you could sort of explain a little bit more about what that journey was like in terms of getting that to be able to get that federal support. And then it'd probably be good to explain to people what the Canadian EOT is and how it compares.
Well, why don't I just step back and start a little bit about what these trust-based exits to employees look like. There are really two of them in the world that matter. One is the ESOP in the US. The other is the EOT in the UK. Both of them are succession plans where the owner of a private business can sell their company to a trust on behalf of all of their employees. And then they get paid out of either through debt provided by the bank or through cash flow from the business over time. And both of those structures were set up by the respective federal governments, in the US in 1974 and the UK in 2014, and designed for this purpose. Like, how do we achieve succession in the private sector of private companies to their workers for the benefit of those workers without changing the way the company works, right? So the thing that makes it work is, because the shares are owned by a trust and not by employees directly, it's the trust that has responsibility for the shareholder owners that are the workers, and they're not making management decisions. Right. So the company continues to be managed in the way it was managed before. And then they report up to the trust, and the trust, says, okay, well, you're doing good, you're doing bad, or whatever. But, and has a specific set of responsibilities. But it isn't like everyone goes to work every day and votes on whether to buy a new machine. Right. Yeah. And for some companies, that'll work. Like, that's called a worker cooperative. And there are lots of them in the world. They tend to work well with smaller companies. But if you're looking at like a 130-person manufacturing plant in rural Missouri, right, that it's been run by a certain family for 70 years, and that family doesn't want to sell to a private equity firm, how do you transition, right? You can't say, okay, now the 130 employees run the place, because the owner wants to get paid out over time. Like, they are relying on that business continuing to be sustainable. So this allows for a smooth transition from a management perspective, and the kind of maintenance of like the things that have made that company work, and then the owner gets paid out over time. So that's how the trust structure works. In the US, there are about 6,500 of these things. They've been very successful. The employees control about $1.7 trillion in assets as an outcome of that policy. In the UK, it's only been established for 10 years, and now 6% of all transactions in the UK are sales to employee ownership trusts. That's like over 300 a year. So dramatic outcomes in both countries. Canada, we have nothing like that. Australia, there's nothing like that. And so we set out to form some version of like, we would advocate for the federal government to create something like that. So I've talked a lot. It's been a 4-year journey, but a relatively successful one. Earlier this year, in June of 2024, the government did pass legislation establishing employee ownership trusts in Canada, and with a substantial tax incentive. The one thing I left out of the other two stories is in both the US and the UK, because of the outcomes of employee ownership, which is more resilient businesses, higher productivity, better growth, and obviously this real wealth distribution to workers, the government is massively supportive of these in the US and the UK with tax incentives. And so in Canada, they've established a tax incentive where the first $10 million of any sale to an employee ownership trust is entirely tax-free in capital gains. So that's where we are.
And that was what was that education process like in terms of sort of getting, helping people understand the impact of employee ownership? Because the reason why I ask, you have these conversations with owners, and look, it's even on a much smaller level. Like, we're looking on that micro level, and they're still thinking, well, I don't see how it's going to work. I don't see how they're actually going to be able to run the company as well as sort of, or it's going to be able to run without me there.
Yeah.
So you're effectively taking that on a macro level, and trying to convince people that may not even been in business that this is just better.
So on the policy side, convincing people that employee ownership is a good idea is actually not that hard.
Okay.
Right. So you kind of explain the policy, you show the outcomes, because we have 50 years of study of these things. We know what they do for the economy. We know they are good. So policymakers pretty quickly are like, okay, this is great. Like, I'm not sacrificing too much here. The workers are the beneficiaries, and every political party is now very pro-worker. How do we support workers from the left to the right? And, this is a thing that will appeal to the business. So from a policy perspective, it's not too hard to sell. Mm-hmm. Selling the Ministry of Finance on it is another story, but we did work through that. On the business owner side, that will take time. We have not achieved success on that yet. We are just starting to build awareness that this is available in Canada. The thing was established in June, so nobody's done it yet, right? I know there are lots of deals in progress, which is great, but we don't know. And it will take time for people to realize that it doesn't mean you have to leave right away. So the way just for any owner watching this, okay, there are some misconceptions about how these things work. If you sell to an EOT, you do not have to leave, right? If you run the business, you can continue to run the business. The shift in governance means that you don't control the board anymore, but you can still have 40% of the representatives on the board. You can have 40% of the representatives on the trustee board. So you still have influence over the company to make sure that both you can get paid out, and also to make sure that the legacy of the thing that you care about continues to operate in the way that made it successful all these years, right? There's two reasons why people do this. One, it's an exit that they can kind of control and where they can see their path to being paid out, and preserving a legacy. Preserving a legacy is so important to a business owner who has built something that they deeply care about over time. These are not financial engineers, right, who bought something 4 years ago and now need to exit so they can buy something bigger. These are people who have built a community within a community, right, and who care deeply about both of those communities. How do I exit this without ruining what I've built? Mm-hmm. It's not going to appeal to everyone, right? There will be business owners who will say, this is too hard. I want a quick exit. When I sell it, I want to be done. That doesn't exist, by the way. You sell the private. I can tell you, that doesn't work that way, but that's okay. Everyone will learn that in their time, but it will appeal to a certain subset. And if that subset ends up being 6% of all transactions, that's huge, right? That is a massive shift in how the economy works in a zone.
But surely that subset's got to grow. I mean, you just think about there was something that you said earlier about, hey, the opportunity you identified in the vet sector, which basically they had no one to sell to.
Yeah.
That's if you look at sort of the huge demographic change of the silver tsunami, retiring owners, and the amount of transactions that are actually successfully completed every year, it's less than 5% of the amount of businesses for people who want to retire. People are not going to have a choice but to look at these other alternatives, surely.
Yeah, look, I don't think employee ownership is the answer to everything. I think there's some people who believe it is. I don't believe it. I think it is a big part of the solution. I think if that subset grows from 6% to 10%, great. Will it be higher than 10%? I doubt it. And the reason is you do need to hit a certain set of criteria. You need stable cash flow, mature industry, a reasonable succession plan, at least at some point in the future. You need to be of a certain age that it's okay that you get paid out over time. So there are certain criteria that have to be there for this structure to work. And they are there for a lot of companies, but they aren't there for a lot of companies. In addition, once the price of a company gets too high, right? So if you're in an industry where the average price for a business is 8 times cash flow, 12 times cash flow or more, it becomes harder for a leveraged approach like an employee ownership trust to pay out over time, right? So there is some, finance that needs to be worked through. There are some industries like construction, light manufacturing, professional services, retail, where the price is not crazy generally. And there is a model where this works. And those are the industries where you see this work in the US and the UK. So do I hope it gets bigger? Sure. I'd love to get to where the UK is today. That'd be a big win. And if we can go higher than that, wonderful. But there are other things that can be done, I think, to try to limit the impact of that concentration of wealth.
Okay. Do you see that like this huge amount of sort of supply that we're going to have of retiring owners creating sort of more business for sale? Do you see that having like downward pressure on those exit multiples and valuations for these businesses?
I generally don't. And the reason is there's just so much money, right? Like there's so much money looking to buy businesses. There's so many people actively looking to do roll-ups. It's like unfortunately, so much of our intellectual capacity has shifted to finance. Right? How do I find ways to, like, if I buy this, then I can combine it with that, and those aren't particularly productive uses of anyone's time or skills, because the things that they're buying existed already, right? Like they're not creating anything. So finance, is a useful tool in some cases, but if taken to the extreme, doesn't create, right? But I do think there's so much of that it will meet. There'll be enough demand for a lot of these businesses. The nice thing is, if you think about a place like construction, or there are other industries where finance tends to go in packs, right? So they decide that veterinary is good, everybody goes into veterinary. That means they also miss industries, right, which are really good industries, and those, hopefully, will become industries where employee ownership can take hold. So I think it'll be a bit of a tit for tat thing, but the critical thing is that the option is there, right? Like there are people, like when we did the Taylor Guitars deal, right? And just to kind of explain, one of the things that we've worked on in the past is trying to shift institutional capital to support employee ownership in the US using their wonderful ESOP structure. So we worked with the Healthcare of Ontario Pension Plan to help finance the sale of Taylor Guitars, which is one of the largest makers of acoustic guitars in the world, to 100% ownership by their workers back in the end of 2020, which is a wonderful deal and a wonderful transaction. And those owners chose less money, right? Because they wanted their legacy to continue. They built the thing from scratch. So I do think there is always going to be a subset of owners where it doesn't matter if finance is out there competing, or where if they're given a credible opportunity to sell to their workers and maintain their community and maintain their legacy and be able to sleep. What's interesting is, because of the activity of private equity buyout funds over the past 20 years, and how tight the business owner community is, the stories get out. So talking to the owners of Taylor Guitars, they said, look, we know all these owners who sold to private equity, they're miserable, right? Do they have an extra yacht? Sure, right? But they're miserable. They go back to their company and are sad.
Yeah.
And we do not want to die looking back on this thing that we spent 40 years building and be sad, right? I've heard that story from so many owners of businesses who said their friend did this and their friend did that, and they spent 2 years in misery working for these new owners that they thought didn't give a damn about the future of their company. I don't want that. Give me another option. Yeah. And for those people, this will be another option.
Okay. And look, on the other side of that, I mean, the Canadian pension funds have been doing direct investments for a while. Like, you guys, you're famous for it up there. But it's my understanding this is the first one with regards to an ESOP, right, into an employee owner. So from their side, obviously, I'm sure that there was sort of comparable financial returns. But was there anything else that, were they interested in the social outcomes as well?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
So absolutely. It was a wonderful deal on all sides. Hoop was an amazing partner. That's Healthcare of Ontario Pension Plan. it met their commercial return requirements for their members, and they loved talking about the implications of this social outcome. The nice thing about the pension fund doing that directly is that they're very patient capital. It's proven out, in kind of working with them as co-financers. I mean, by co, I mean they're them and us, but whatever. They've been very patient and very respectful and very thoughtful, and they have cared about what we're trying to do in transitioning the company over to employees. And I hope to see more of that. The challenge with pension funds is the requirement for deal size is very high. So there aren't that many Taylor guitar sized deals in employee ownership. We haven't cracked the nut on how to take that money that wants to do this type of work and be able to put it to use in the smaller, kind of $25 to $75 million financings that are quite prevalent in the American ESOP space. But that's a longer conversation. But no, they were wonderful to work with. And I think we'll try to do it again.
Okay. So a little bit earlier, you talked about pools of capital, how they follow each other, how they sort of, they travel around. And social capital partners, when you guys talk about an impact thesis for some of your work with regards to the ownership fund, obviously some of that's to buck that trend. It'd be great if you could talk a little bit more about what that thesis is.
Yeah. So we built something called the Ownership Fund a few years ago. We called it Ownership Lens Investing. The idea being, can you invest in a way where the outcome you're trying to create is broader access to ownership in whatever form? So, we did it because we were so deep on employee ownership, and we know that there's a lot more out there, right? Like home ownership is obviously by far the biggest issue, right? Like that's for people. Owning a home is by far the biggest issue. Are there interesting ideas there? What about independent business ownership? So we talk about all these roll-ups. What are the things that can enable independent business owners to be more successful? Community ownership, right? How do you shift certain parcels of land into community ownership? We'll have a better approach to stewardship. So we wanted to bucket all of those under one umbrella, and that's what the ownership fund is. And we've managed to find some really interesting investments across all of those categories, right? One I love to talk about is IndieGraph, which is a digital, so they provide the digital backend for local journalists who want to produce their own newsletters, paid newsletters for their local communities, right? So
Super cool.
Like local journalism is dying, right?
Yeah.
However, there are journalists in local communities who say, screw that. I'm going to set out on my own. I'm going to report on this community, and I'm going to provide the community the opportunity to access that information. And IndieGraph is the digital backend for that. So they help those entrepreneurs become successful within their local communities, also providing access to local journalism. Just a wonderful example of how you can invest in something that then creates ownership across the economy in a resilient way. I think they have, 150 or some odd local journalists now on their platform across North America, often focused on, indigenous issues or issues for people of color or underserved local communities. So wonderful. We haven't been able to invest in this, but we think it has a lot of potential and is doing quite well. It's called bookshop.org, which is a website I think it's available in the US and in the UK, that sells books online, where the books are provided by local independent bookstores. So the independent bookstores can upload their catalog to the system, and then someone says, I want to order a book, just like they would on Amazon. It gets shipped from the independent bookstore closest to you. Do you have to wait an extra day? I don't know. I can't use it. I'm in Canada. They don't exist out here. Maybe you don't. Either way, who cares?
Yeah.
Right?
And you're supporting the local communities. Like that's
the price is comparable, right, to Amazon, because Amazon isn't actually cheap anymore. So these are the kinds of things that people don't think about when they think about ownership, right? But this is ownership, right? How do we combat consolidation in both monopoly settings like Amazon, or in, who owns the local bookstore, who owns the local hardware store, right? In Canada, we have something called home hardware, right? Which is where the local hardware store is a part owner in a cooperative called home hardware. And the cooperative does all the marketing and, the technology and whatever, the back end, and negotiates deals. But the people who are successful, the people who benefit, are these local owners, right, of hardware stores.
Is that similar to ACE in the US?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Or Carpet One, right? So Carpet One in the US is a wonderful story. CCI Global, I think they're called, out of like somewhere in the Northeast, which is like the largest. They sell twice as much flooring in the US as Home Depot, all locally owned. Each of those owners have a part of this owner-owned cooperative that does all the work that Home Depot does, but the outcomes are for local ownership. Wonderful.
Yeah, wonderful story. So, I just want to touch on something you said earlier about when we were talking about the trust models between the ESOP and the EOT in the UK. Something you talked about, like they don't, where the employees don't have a direct say in the business. They're not part of they're not part of the democratic process. I mean, there are a lot of people in the employee ownership space who do talk about that being a key element, to make people have more joy and enjoyment when they come to work, is the fact that they actually get to have a say in the business. How do you see that playing out in, say, like the Canadian EOT model? Does it have a role?
Look, I think there are people who look at this stuff very theoretical and paint with a very big brush, sometimes like a roller. Companies are all different, right?
Yeah.
There are employees who do not want to go into the manufacturing plant and decide on how that day's roster should be allocated, or decide on whether to buy a new truck, right? They want to go into their work and do a good job and be respected and have some control over their own work, make more money, whatever it is. And some companies, people want to come in and say, yeah, damn it, you're making some wrong decisions and I want to be, involved in that. And, you have to make the right decision for your company. So I don't think there is a broad brush to be applied. Some companies should be worker cooperatives. Some companies shouldn't. Some companies should be owned through an employee ownership trust, and some companies shouldn't. That's okay.
Yeah, no, I was just saying that I guess the slight sort of nuance to look at, you're obviously talking about sort of some fairly granular type of decisions. Hey, look, sort of aligning on sort of shifts. Like, I think if you look at sort of the data that's sort of coming out of Rutgers and for what the NCEO have put out, they sort of talk about the fact that to get the real value out of employee ownership, people need to they need to have visibility into how the business is performing, and then they need to be empowered to act on that information. And so if that may not be, hey, I don't want to have to try to get someone to fill this shift, but it may be like, hey, I know that we're going to be short in the coming months, and I've got an idea, but I've got an opportunity to be able to put that idea forward, and it is going to be heard. Like, there's sort of a lens difference.
No. So I look at it as two buckets, right? So there's there's ownership, which produces wealth outcomes, and then there's ownership culture, which produces corporate outcomes. And ownership culture can be installed whether there's ownership or not, right? Costco is a wonderful example of a company that invests in all of the things you just described. So people have certain ownership over their own work, which is what studies show people actually care about. They don't want to own corporate strategy. They want to own their own day-to-day. And so Costco does a really good job of that.
Mm-hmm.
Awareness about how their store is doing, about how the company is doing, how that matters to them. So all of that stuff Costco does without any ownership, which creates an ownership culture. If you pair that business philosophy, which every company should do, but not every company does do, with actual ownership, then of course there's a multiplier effect, right? So all of those studies, I'm sure, are true, that if you can establish employee ownership, like an ownership culture, and pair it with actual ownership where you can see the outcomes in terms of share price, totally believe that there's a multiplier effect. However, I think there is virtue in simply the transfer of wealth. I think it is in every company's best interests to also imbue an ownership culture that allows people to understand the implications of their work on the company, on their own lives, and if you pair that with actual wealth generation and share price, all the better.
Yeah. It's just like,
I don't know if it makes sense, but I feel like it's worth separating those things.
100%. Okay, and I do love that delineation. Hey, look, there is virtue in just the transfer of wealth alone. I mean, ultimately, you'd think that sort of employees, just the fact that they do have that transfer of wealth, they've got that transfer of equity, they're going to want that for the long term, and so going to obviously act in the best interest of the business. But when it comes to that ownership culture, really sort of dialing it up and getting the real value out of any transition to employee ownership, or any transition to, as you said, just any business, like a great employee-owned business is just a great business. Right?
Totally.
And
100%.
yeah, a great business is embodies all the things that are required to make a great employee-owned business. So yeah,
100%.
100%
And look,
on that.
employee ownership does allow you to center those things. And that is, so
Mhm.
it's a great tool if you have access to it. I'd say one more thing, Andy, which is that employee ownership does this transfer of wealth, like without question. There's a thing that is done that is inarguable.
Yeah.
Majority, and that, there's a lot of different approaches to that, whether it's employee ownership or stock options or whatever. Majority employee ownership does one other thing that no other forms of employee ownership can do, and that is change the incentives of ownership, right? The incentives of the owners, right? And that is critical. So one of the really interesting findings out of US employee ownership is the majority employee-owned companies tend to perform much better during recessions, and coming out of recessions, like massively outperform. And when I mean don't do much better out of recessions, they default less, they lay off fewer employees, they sustain their revenue, and then outperform out of a recession. Why? The reason is they don't care about sacrificing short-term profit during what is obviously a tough time in order to maintain company culture and capacity. Whereas if the incentives of that owner are different, let's say they're late in their ownership from a private equity buyout fund, need to sell in a couple of years, they need to maintain their EBITDA. That is their incentive. And so it doesn't matter what employee ownership they have in place. If they're the majority owner, they're going to drive outcomes, which means layoffs, which means reducing capacity, which means less resilience for the economy. That is a proven and logical result of majority employee ownership, which is why we spend so much time thinking about majority employee ownership, because it has these outcomes about economic resilience and resilience for individuals and workers in times of stress.
So with that in mind, like how does, if you look at, say, like the ownership works model of ownership is not majority ownership, and they're partnered with private equity funds who do have those horizons. What are your thoughts on that model?
Well, I think it achieves the first purpose of wealth transfer, right? So it doesn't and will never achieve the resilience and sort of incentive shift. Can't, because you're not transferring majority ownership or control, but it does shift wealth. And look, if a private equity company wants to sign up to give away 2 or 3% of their proceeds to workers, great, right?
Yeah.
Better than not. So, how can you not want them to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so looking into the future, like what do you see as the future for employee ownership in Canada, and like how do you see it now that you guys have the EOT? How do you see it evolving over the next decade?
It really depends on one thing. Okay. So the catch with the government's policy is the tax incentive is set to expire at the end of 2026.
Oh wow!
Yes. If we are able to encourage enough folks to sell to an EOT, or if enough owners choose to sell to an EOT in the next few years, and we're able to convince whomever is the government at the time to make that tax incentive permanent, then it is inarguable that there's a bright future for employee ownership trusts in Canada. Our economy is the same as the UK's in every meaningful way, right? So 6% of their transactions sell to EOT, 6% of our transactions will sell to EOTs. If you wanted to present another case, you need to work really hard, right? Because there's no good reason. We have to be successful in growing this quickly and growing our advocacy capacity quickly so that we can convince the government of the day, whomever it is, to make this permanent, like they've done in the US and like they've done in the UK. It is, by our reckoning, maybe the only example of a sunsetting tax incentive in Canada. So, we are optimistic that because the Conservative Party loves employee ownership trust. Obviously, the Liberal Party loves employee ownership trust. The NDP is quite favorably disposed to employee ownership trust. So, we are, again, optimistic. But if we cannot get that done, then I am much less optimistic. So we have a lot of work to do next couple of years.
Fingers crossed. So, Matt, as we finish up, I'd like to just jump into a fast round of questions where I ask you 3 questions and you offer a quick response. That sound okay?
I'm bad at quick responses. I'll do the best I can.
Well, yeah, we'll see. Well, let's see. So the first one is, who is the leader you most admire in employee ownership?
Joseph Bossi.
Okay.
I can say more if you want.
No, that was quick. I love it. You said,
yeah.
No,
50 years, this guy has been pushing the ball uphill. He is I think in his 80s now. He is a marvel, flying I was at a session with him recently, he was flying on the red eye, which I won't do anymore. He's like 80. He's flying on the red eye back to Washington in order to go to an important meeting. The guy is a marvel.
Wow, awesome. So what is your favorite resource on employee ownership?
Look, I mean, Rutgers does amazing work, I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, on this deep work. So they've got to be the go-to.
Okay. And then finally, what would you say to a business owner who's sitting on the fence regarding employee ownership?
Look, you will hear all sorts of things about EOTs from advisors. Find an advisor who you trust and who actually knows about the process of the EOT. It isn't more complicated than selling to a third party. Selling to a third party comes with a whole bunch of handcuffs and time constraints, things that you will not want to do. You have to do equality of earnings. There's a whole bunch of things tied to a third. It is not nearly the simple exit that you will be told. So spend the time to figure out whether this is right for you. As someone who has sold a business, the legacy of your business, the people who own it after you, matter way more than you think. Ask your friends. They will tell you that who owns the business after you will mean more to the future, to your life in the future and your family in the future than whether you make 10% more on the sale of your business.
That's great. Thank you. So, John, that brings us to a close today. Where can people follow you or learn more about the work that you're doing at Social Capital Partners?
Well, I would say we are relaunching the employee ownership website. So that's the first port of call, employee-ownership.ca. There's going to be a really cool promotional video. By the time this, it'll be out by the time this comes out. Social Capital Partners is socialcapitalpartners.ca. The only place where I post is LinkedIn. That hellhole that Elon created is not for me. So I am followable on LinkedIn if you can put up with some of my random rants from time to time.
Well, John, thank you very much for those random rants, and thank you very much for, I would say, all your leadership in the space, and for sharing your thoughts with us today. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Andy. Appreciate the time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to continue learning about employee ownership as an alternative exit, head across to abettermonday.me for additional links and resources. You can also make sure to subscribe or follow along in your favorite podcast app, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review.